A dog was barking somewhere far off, up the ridge where the old logging road disappeared into rock and scrub brush. Selene Caulfield stood at the edge of the switchback path and listened carefully. The sound bounced off the valley walls below and came back thin and hollow. She knew that particular feeling of loneliness. She had been carrying it for 3 months now, ever since the group home in Asheville told her she had aged out of the system. The caseworker had handed her a manila envelope with her birth certificate and a page of resource phone numbers. He told her she was 20 now, and it was time to begin her life. Selene had wanted to ask what life he meant exactly. She had no family anywhere, no savings of any kind, no apartment lined up, and no cosigner for one. The group home had been her address since she was 14 years old, when her grandmother passed from a stroke, and no relative stepped forward to claim her. 6 years of shared bedrooms and rotating staff members and birthday cakes purchased with state funds. And then, on a Tuesday morning in January, a handshake and a bus ticket to anywhere she wanted. She drifted east through the mountains that winter and into the early spring. She picked up dishwashing shifts in Burnsville for 3 weeks. Slept in a church basement for 2 weeks until the pastor's wife gently suggested she move along. She washed her clothes in gas station bathrooms with hand soap. Ate dollar bread with peanut butter every day. She kept moving because stopping meant thinking too much, and thinking led to dark places she could not afford to visit. Then she found Bakersville. The town sat deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Mitchell County, tucked into the western edge of the Carolinas. The population hovered around 450 on a generous count. There were a handful of brick storefronts along a quiet main road that bent through the center of the valley. A post office the size of a living room. A diner with a crooked green awning, and a neon sign that buzzed at night. Mountains rose on every side of the town like walls built around a cradle, protective and close. Selene walked into the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in late March because the sign on the door said open and she desperately needed to use the restroom. The office smelled like old paper and instant coffee. The woman behind the counter asked if she could help. Selene said she was just passing through and asked about the restroom. The woman looked up then and studied her carefully for a long moment. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a coffee mug on the desk that said World's Okayest Gardener in faded green letters. Her name tag read, Yolena Whiteside, Mitchell County Clerk. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal today," Yolena said evenly. Selene did not answer that question, which was answer enough for both of them. Yolena opened her desk drawer and pulled out a granola bar and a sealed bottle of spring water. "Sit down for a minute. You're not bothering anyone in here." Selene sat in the wooden chair beside the counter. She ate the granola bar slowly, breaking it into small pieces and making each one last as long as she could. While she chewed, her eyes drifted across the room and landed on a bulletin board near the front door. Tacked among flyers for church suppers and missing cat notices was a yellow sheet of paper with bold black lettering. It read, Abandoned Property, Cobbler Shop, Switchback Road, $10, as is, Inquire at Clerk. Selena pointed at the yellow notice with a piece of granola bar still in her hand and asked what it was about. Yolena glanced over at the board and then back at Selena. Old Cobbler Shop about 2 miles up the hill past the Methodist Cemetery. Been sitting empty since about 1987 or so. The owner died without any heirs or a will. County took it for back taxes a long time ago. Nobody has ever wanted the place. It is a steep climb on a dirt road, and the roof leaks badly. Selene asked if somebody could really buy a building for $10. Yolena said that was exactly what it said on the paper. The county just wanted the property off the tax books at this point. She paused and folded her arms across her chest. "You are not seriously thinking about buying it." Selene pulled a folded $10 bill from her back pocket and smoothed it flat on the counter. It was the very last of her dishwashing money from Burnsville. "Can I at least go see it first before I decide?" They drove up the mountain in Yolena's old blue truck. The narrow dirt road hugged the steep mountainside through tight switchbacks. The valley dropped away below them on the right side, green and wide and streaked with morning fog, with ridge lines stacking into pale blue haze. Yellow and purple wildflowers grew from cracks in the exposed rock along the roadside. A few birch trees clung to the slope with their white bark curling and peeling in the steady wind coming up from the valley floor. The cobbler shop appeared around a sharp bend in the road. It was 2 stories tall, wood frame on a thick stone foundation. A retaining wall of stacked fieldstone on the uphill side held back the slope. The front porch sagged noticeably on the left end. The windows were clouded with years of accumulated grime. A rusted iron sign shaped like a boot hung from a wrought iron bracket by a single remaining nail. Built around 1878 according to the county records, Yolena said, putting the truck in park. Man named Asa Dunlap ran it, made boots and shoes for the whole county. His son took over after him, then his grandson. The last Dunlap closed up shop in the mid-1980s when cheap imports made the trade pointless. Celine climbed out and walked the length of the porch carefully. The boards creaked and shifted under her weight, but held firm enough. She pressed her face to a grimy window and peered inside. She could make out a dim room with a long wooden counter running most of the back wall, shelves built along both side walls, and a black potbelly stove standing in the far corner. Everything was coated in thick gray dust, but the structure looked solid underneath it all. She could see the stone walls of the basement level through a gap in the floor, and they appeared to be at least 2 feet thick. "I will take it," she said, turning back to Yolena with certainty in her voice. Yolena asked if she was absolutely sure. No running water. Electric disconnected for years. Selene told her she was completely sure. She signed the deed transfer papers that same afternoon at the clerk's counter. Yolena notarized them herself and charged nothing at all for the service. If you are enjoying this story, tap subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. It means a lot to have you here. Selene moved into the cobbler shop that evening with a sleeping bag, a dollar store flashlight, and the clothes she was wearing on her back. The first night, she lay on the bare wooden floor of the old shop and listened to wind pushing through the gaps in the wooden siding. Mice scratched and scurried inside the walls around her. An owl called from somewhere far down the valley, its voice carrying clearly through the cold mountain air. She was completely alone inside a building on a steep mountainside in a town where she knew exactly one person by name. But the building was hers. She owned it outright and free and clear. Nobody could tell her to move along from her own property. The dog showed up on the 3rd morning after she moved in. Selene was hauling water from a spring she had found about 200 yards down the slope below the shop. She filled a plastic milk jug at the trickle coming from between 2 mossy rocks. On her way back up the path, she heard rustling and scratching in the scrub brush off to her left side. A small brindle-colored shape emerged from behind a large rock outcrop and stood in the middle of the dirt path, staring at her. It was a Cairn Terrier mix, maybe 14 pounds at most, with a rough, wiry coat and dark brindle coloring, black and golden-brown stripes over his entire body. He had pointed upright ears and bright dark eyes that watched her with intense focus. A scruffy beard jutted from his chin and made him look like a tiny disheveled professor who had been sleeping in the woods. His stubby tail wagged so hard and fast that his entire back end swayed from side to side. Selene set down her water jug on the path and knelt to his level. The dog trotted up and sat at her feet like he had been waiting for her specifically. He looked up at her and tilted his scruffy head to the left. She checked around his neck for a collar. Nothing there at all. She could feel his ribs pressing clearly through the rough, wiry coat. Burrs and small sticks were matted deep into his beard and chest fur. She broke off half of her peanut butter sandwich and set it on the ground in front of him. He ate it with the quiet, desperate focus of an animal who had gone without food for several days in a row. When Selene picked up her water jug and walked back up the steep hill toward the shop, he followed right behind her without hesitation. When she stepped through the front door, he walked through the door right after her. When she sat down cross-legged on the dusty floor, he climbed directly into her lap and let out a long, shuddering sigh like he had finally found the place he had been searching for. She studied his rough coat, the way every strand of fur stuck out at sharp angles, like he had walked through a patch of stinging plants. She decided to call him Nettle, because he looked prickly and wild on the outside, but was clearly soft and good underneath all of it. "I guess it is just you and me now, Nettle," she said to him. He stretched up and licked her chin once, then settled back into her lap and closed his eyes. The renovation work began with whatever Selene could find or scavenge for free from the surrounding mountainside. She hauled fallen branches from the rocky slope above the shop for firewood. She gathered flat stones from a creek bed further down the hill to patch gaps in the retaining wall. She bought tar paper and roofing cement from the hardware store in Spruce Pine for $28. She patched the worst roof leaks that dripped onto the shop floor every time it rained. Yelena drove up one afternoon and gave her an old single-burner camping stove and a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her late mother. "You are going to need real help with this place," Yelena said, standing on the sagging porch. "I will figure it out," Selena replied. "That is exactly what worries me about you," Yelena said with a half-smile. A man named Reginald Pace came walking up the switchback road on the 4th day after Selene moved in. He was 72 years old, a retired Finnish carpenter who lived alone in a small cabin about half a mile further down the same dirt road. He had apparently spotted Selene carrying salvaged lumber scraps up the steep hill on her back over the past several days. "You know anything about structural framing?" he asked from the bottom of her porch steps, hands in the pockets of his canvas work jacket. "Not yet," Selene told him from the porch above. Reginald smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that came from decades of watching young people attempt hard things with more courage than skill. "I will teach you the basics. Got nothing else going on these days." He showed her how to sister a cracked floor joist with a fresh board bolted alongside it, how to level a sagging beam using cedar shims tapped in with a mallet, how to read the grain direction in a board before making any cuts so the wood would not split on her. They replaced the 4 worst porch boards together using rough-cut lumber that Reginald had stacked and drying in his barn from a poplar tree he had taken down the previous autumn. The total cost for lumber was exactly $0. "You are a quick study," he told her after watching her set her 3rd shim perfectly on the first try. "I had to be," Selene answered quietly. She did not explain further. Reginald did not ask. The diner down in town was called the Mountain Laurel Cafe. The owner and head cook was a sturdy woman named Georgette Plank, who had run the place for 22 years straight. She hired Selene to wash dishes and bus tables on 3 mornings each week. The pay was $9 an hour in cash at the end of every shift. Selene spent that money with extreme care and precision, roofing nails from the hardware store, caulk to seal the window frames where cold air whistled through, a 60-pound bag of concrete mix to patch a section of the stone foundation where it had cracked and begun to separate, 2 panes of window glass to replace the broken ones that let rain blow inside, a box of wood screws, and a second-hand hand drill from a yard sale in Spruce Pine for $12. Total renovation spending over the course of 6 weeks came to $847. She cleaned the entire shop from floor to ceiling over 3 solid days of scrubbing. She swept out decades of accumulated dust and dried mouse droppings and crumbling dead leaves. She scrubbed the old wooden counter with a stiff brush until the red oak grain underneath finally showed through the layers of grime. She polished the potbelly stove with steel wool and discovered it still worked perfectly when she built a small test fire inside it. She oiled every door hinge until they stopped squeaking. She washed each window pane inside and out until actual light came through for the first time in decades. The cobbler shop began to look like something worth caring about. Not perfect by any stretch, not anywhere close to finished, but alive again, after all those years of sitting empty and forgotten on the mountainside. Nettle supervised every bit of the renovation, from his self-appointed post on the front porch. He would sit there for hours with his scruffy bearded face pointed down toward the valley. His stubby tail thumped against the porch boards whenever Celine walked past carrying tools or supplies. It was Nettle who found the way down to the basement. Celine had known a basement existed underneath the main floor. The stone foundation was clearly visible from the outside of the building, and there was a narrow exterior stairway built into the downhill side of the structure. But the swollen wooden door at the bottom of those steps had been jammed completely shut for years, and she had focused all her energy and limited resources on the main floor first. On a cool Thursday evening in her 7th week at the property, Nettle began scratching persistently at a spot on the floor behind the potbelly stove. He scratched and whined and then scratched some more until Celine finally walked over and moved the heavy iron stove aside to investigate. Underneath, half concealed by a warped square of old linoleum that had been glued to the floor, she found a trapdoor cut into the wooden planks with a recessed iron ring pull. "What exactly did you find down there, Nettle?" she asked him. He wagged his stubby tail rapidly and barked once, sharp and high and absolutely certain about whatever was below their feet. She gripped the iron ring and pulled the trapdoor open. It came up with a groan of old wood and a rush of cool, dry air from below. A wooden ladder descended straight down into darkness. She turned on her flashlight and shined the beam downward. She could see a stone-walled room that appeared dry and surprisingly clean for having been sealed for so many years. The thick stone walls had apparently kept out moisture successfully for well over a century. Celine lowered herself carefully down the ladder. Nettle stood at the top of the opening and whined anxiously until she climbed back up and carried him down tucked under one arm. The basement was roughly 15 feet wide by 20 feet deep. Heavy wooden workbenches lined 3 of the 4 stone walls. Old wooden shoe lasts in various sizes and curled scraps of dried leather sat on dusty shelves. But in the far corner of the room, away from the workbenches and covered completely by a heavy canvas tarp, was something that did not belong with cobbling supplies at all. Celine grabbed the edge of the canvas tarp and pulled it back slowly. Her flashlight beam swept across the revealed objects and she stopped breathing entirely for a long, suspended moment. Wooden animals. Hand-carved wooden animals, 8 of them in total, each standing between 18 and 24 inches tall on their own carved bases. 2 horses stood with arched necks and flowing manes carved in fine detail. A rooster displayed fully spread tail feathers that fanned out behind him majestically. A rabbit crouched low and alert with its long ears pressed back. A deer stood proud with elaborate branching antlers. A bear rose up on its hind legs with its front paws raised. A fox strode forward mid-step with its long, bushy tail streaming out behind. A swan floated with both wings raised halfway as if about to take flight from still water. Every single animal was carved with absolutely extraordinary precision and detail. She could see individual muscle definition in the horse's shoulders and haunches. The rooster had separate feathers carved into his tail and breast. The bear had fur texture across its entire body that looked almost real enough to touch and feel rough under her fingertips. And all of them were painted in vivid, brilliant colors. The paint had been protected from light and moisture for decades in this sealed stone basement. The 2 horses were finished in dappled gray and rich chestnut brown. The rooster blazed with deep reds and shimmering golds and touches of emerald green. The rabbit was painted soft brown with a clean white chest. The colors were remarkably vivid, almost shockingly bright in the beam of her flashlight after so many years in the dark. Celine whispered something she could not even hear herself say. Nettle went from animal to animal, sniffing each carved figure carefully and thoroughly, his stubby tail wagging the entire time as though he approved of every single one. Sitting beside the row of carousel animals was a sturdy wooden box with brass corner fittings. Celine lifted the lid and found a hand-crank music box mechanism inside, built entirely of carved wood gears and polished brass pins and a small brass drum. She turned the crank handle gently and slowly. It still worked after all these years. A waltz melody tinkled out into the stone basement, thin and sweet and impossibly old, the notes bouncing softly off the rock walls. And beneath the music box, wrapped carefully in a sheet of waxed oilcloth for protection, lay a leather portfolio tied shut with a leather cord. Selene untied the cord and opened the portfolio and found 14 watercolor paintings inside. Each one depicted a different species of Blue Ridge Mountain wildflower: trillium in white and deep pink, fire pink in brilliant scarlet, flame azalea in burning orange, mountain laurel in clusters of soft pale pink. Each painting was executed with delicate botanical precision on sheets of heavy cotton rag paper, and each one was signed in the lower right corner with the careful initials E.R.D. Selene sat down slowly on the cold stone floor of the basement. The carousel animals stood in a semicircle around her. The music box played its gentle waltz while the watercolor paintings lay spread across her knees. She began to cry, not from sadness or from grief, from the overwhelming strangeness of finding something this precious hidden for decades in a place every person in the county had forgotten. Nettle climbed into her lap right on top of the paintings and pressed his scruffy, warm head firmly against her chest. She carried everything upstairs the following morning, making trip after careful trip up and down the wooden ladder, wrapping each carved animal in her spare clothing and her sleeping bag for padding. She arranged all 8 animals in a neat row along the old oak counter. In full daylight, streaming through the newly cleaned windows, the carousel figures were even more stunning than they had appeared in the flashlight beam. The carving was genuinely museum-quality work. The original milk paint colors had barely faded at all. Yelena drove up the mountain to see the discovery that same afternoon after Selene walked down to the diner and called her from the payphone. Yelena stood in the shop doorway and put her hand over her mouth and did not speak for nearly a full minute. "Do you have any idea what these are?" she finally asked in a hushed voice. Selene said they were miniature carousel animals, carved and painted by hand. She had no idea who made them. Yelena walked to the counter and picked up the carved fox gently. She turned it over in her hands. Carved into the flat bottom in tiny, precise letters were the words, A. Dunlap, 1923. Asa Dunlap's grandson carved these, the 3rd-generation cobbler in this building. He was also a master wood carver. Selene asked about the paintings. Yelena examined the initials on the nearest watercolor. E.R.D. Elizabeth Ruth Dunlap, his wife. She was known around here for her wildflower paintings. Sold her work at the craft fairs in Burnsville and at Penland. Yelena looked up at Selene with wide, serious eyes. These pieces might be worth real money. If this story is keeping you company tonight, please leave a comment down below and let me know you are out there. Your words truly keep these stories going. Reginald knew a woman over in Asheville who specialized in appraising Appalachian folk art. Her name was Dr. Viveka Strand, a retired art history professor from Warren Wilson College who now worked as an independent consultant for regional museums and private collectors throughout the Southeast. Selena rode down the mountain with Yelena the following week. They packed all 8 carousel animals, the music box, and the watercolor portfolio in cardboard boxes padded with crumpled newspaper. Dr. Strand examined each piece individually for well over an hour in her bright studio apartment. She used a jeweler's magnifying loupe. She photographed the paint surfaces at multiple angles. She measured the precise dimensions and studied the specific carving techniques used on each animal with intense academic focus. She picked up the music box mechanism and turned the brass crank and listened to the waltz with her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly to one side. "These are truly exceptional," she said at last, setting down the bear. "Hand-carved from native yellow poplar. The paint is original milk paint, which is why the colors survived so well. The craftsmanship is professional grade, and this music box is a custom build. I've only seen 2 others like it in my career." Selene asked about the watercolors. Dr. Strand opened the portfolio with careful, gloved hands. Elizabeth Dunlap exhibited at the Southern Highland Craft Guild in the 1920s and 1930s. Her work is in 3 known private collections. These 14 paintings are previously unknown. They would significantly expand her documented body of work. Selene asked what everything was worth, leaning forward in her chair. Dr. Strand folded her hands together. The carousel animals with the music box, between $24,000 and $34,000 at auction. The watercolors, given the condition and the artist's history, between $15,000 and $18,000. Celine sat very still and asked for the total. Dr. Strand said conservatively, between $39,000 and $52,000 for the entire collection. The room went very quiet after those numbers. Celine looked down at her own hands resting on her knees. They were rough and scraped and calloused from 7 weeks of scrubbing floors and hammering nails and hauling water up a steep mountain every single day. She was 20 years old. She owned a cobbler shop she had purchased for $10. And hidden in its basement, she had stumbled onto a treasure worth more money than she had ever imagined having in her entire life. "What should I do with all of it?" she asked softly. Dr. Strand looked at her with genuine kindness in her expression. "That depends entirely on what you want for yourself." What Celine Caulfield wanted, she realized in that quiet moment, was not to sell everything and leave Bakersville behind. She had spent her whole life leaving places. Every group home, every church basement, every temporary arrangement had ended the same way. What she actually wanted, maybe for the first time in 20 years, was simply to stay. She kept all 14 of the watercolor paintings for herself. She framed each one individually using simple wooden frames she bought for $2 apiece at the thrift shop in Spruce Pine. She hung all 14 of Elizabeth Dunlap's mountain wildflower paintings along the freshly cleaned walls of the Cobbler shop, where the artist had once actually lived and worked alongside her husband. She sold 4 of the 8 carousel animals through Dr. Strand's auction connections to a serious folk art collector based in Knoxville. The 2 horses, the bear, and the swan found new homes together. They brought a total of $18,400 after the auction house commission was subtracted. She kept the rooster, the rabbit, the deer, and the fox for herself. She kept the music box and its waltz. With the sale money, Celine did 3 important things. She paid a well drilling company to bore a new well and run a proper water line up the hill to the shop. She hired an electrician to reconnect the electrical service to the building. And she deposited the remaining balance into a savings account at the credit union branch in Spruce Pine. It was the first bank account she had ever had in her name. She sat in the credit union lobby and stared at the printed passbook balance for a solid 10 minutes. "I have a bank account," she whispered to Nettle in the lobby. He wagged his stubby tail. The cobbler's shop gradually became something entirely new over the following months. Celine converted the main floor into a small combination studio and gallery space. She arranged the 4 remaining carousel animals on display along the old oak counter, where customers had once picked up their repaired boots and shoes. She kept Elizabeth Dunlap's wildflower paintings hanging proudly on all the walls. She placed the music box on a small table right beside the front door where any visitor could reach over and turn the brass crank and hear the old waltz fill the room. She began learning basic leather work from a woman named Petra Vogel, who operated a craft studio near the Penland School of Craft about 30 minutes away. Simple hand stitching came first, then leather tooling and stamping, then precision cutting with proper knives. Celine made small leather goods with her own hands at the old counter in the shop, wallets and card holders, leather key fobs with simple stamped designs, hand-stitched journal covers in various sizes. She sold these pieces from the shop counter on weekends when hikers and tourists occasionally wandered up the Switchback Road. Word about the cobbler shop spread through the surrounding mountain communities the way news always does in small Appalachian towns, quietly and steadily, passed by mention from one person to the next over coffee or at church or at the post office. A young woman up on Switchback Road found beautiful old carousel animals in a cobbler shop basement. She is fixing up the whole place by herself. She makes leather goods now and sells them on weekends. You should really drive up there and see what she has done with it. People began to come, not large crowds by any measure, but enough to matter. Weekend visitors from nearby towns who had heard the story, hikers on the mountain trails who stumbled onto the shop and came inside to look around, a retired couple from the far side of the county who drove over specifically to see the carousel animals in person, a young reporter from the Mitchell County newspaper who wrote a feature story about Celine and the Dunlap family legacy that ran on the front page of the weekly edition. Georgette at the Mountain Laurel Cafe started sending her diner customers up the hill regularly. She would tell customers to drive up and see the old Cobbler shop on the switchback road past the cemetery. Reginald built a small wooden sign out of poplar boards and carved the letters by hand with his chisels. He set it up at the very bottom of the switchback road where it met the paved county road. The sign read, "The Old Dunlap Cobbler Shop. Open Saturdays and Sundays." Jolena helped Celine fill out all the county paperwork to file for an official business license. She stamped the approval on the form herself. "You are officially a business owner in Mitchell County," she said with a proud smile. Celine told her she never thought she would be official at anything, looking at the stamped form with something close to disbelief. On a clear Sunday afternoon in the middle of October, Celine Caulfield sat on the repaired front porch of the old Dunlap Cobbler shop with Nettle curled up warm in her lap. The valley spread out far below the hillside in every direction, and the mountains were turning gold and crimson and deep orange with autumn color. The air smelled like wood smoke from the potbelly stove inside and dry, fallen leaves crunching on the path. Through the open front door behind her, Elizabeth Dunlap's wildflower watercolors glowed softly on the walls in the warm lamplight. The carved rooster stood on the counter with his painted tail feathers fanned out in permanent display. The music box waited patiently on its table beside the door for the next visitor to turn the crank. She was 20 years old. She had been sent out into the world with nothing but an envelope of documents and a bus ticket. She had walked into a county clerk's office in a tiny mountain town because she needed a restroom. She had walked out of that same office owning a building. She had found art hidden in a basement, and a dog wandering in the scrub brush, and a community of quiet, generous people who said her name like it belonged in their town. Nettle looked up at her with his bright, dark eyes gleaming in the late afternoon sun. His stubby tail thumped steadily against her leg, keeping time with something only he could hear. Selene whispered to Nettle that they were home. He put his scruffy chin on her knee and sighed contentedly. The October wind carried the faint melody of the waltz down from the open door, out across the porch railing, and into the wide golden valley below. If this story meant something to you tonight, please subscribe and share it with someone who could use a little hope right now. These stories only reach new listeners because you take the time to pass them along. Thank you so much for being here.